blood-brain barrier, but I would need you to have an understanding of what it is before we go any further. Remember, last time we were talking about the protective layers around the brain, and so, of course, the first was the skull, and then we have 3 meninges. What are they from superficial to deep? Dura mater, arachnoid, pia mater, exactly. And then, of course, we also have the cerebrospinal fluid, right? But then that's all around the brain. Now I want to know how the brain protects itself from the inside out. Because once you get into the brain tissue, remember that we looked at this figure multiple times. Where are you? Lost it. Can't find it. Okay. So we looked at this figure multiple times, and we know that once you get deep into the brain tissue, you are, of course, going to have capillaries that go deep into the brain, right? And you actually have capillaries within a millimeter or so of every single neuron. So it's an incredibly vascular tissue. So there's stuff that is in your capillaries that you don't want in your brain. So how does your brain actually protect itself? The way that the brain protects itself is that in each capillary, there is what we call a blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is inside the brain, not outside the brain. The blood-brain barrier allows for the brain to control what actually exits the capillary and goes into the tissue. So I want you guys to imagine that you are the cells in a capillary. Do you remember what kind of tissue capillaries are made of? The thinnest tissue you can think of. Simple squamous epithelium. So you guys are made of simple squamous epithelium. I am something funky, and you guys are all neurons. Okay. So what I want to know is how do you prevent the funky stuff from getting at the neurons? And remember, it's a big deal because neurons are amitotic, right? You lose them, they're gone. Okay. So how do we prevent it? Well, the blood-brain barrier is a barrier in 2 ways. It's an anatomical barrier, and it's also a physiological barrier. The anatomical barrier is because every single cell in the capillary, you guys are the endo or epithelial cells. You guys have the tightest of tight junctions between you, okay? And they are so tight, they are called continuous, complete tight junctions. Basically, I am not screwing around tight junctions, right? Okay, so do you remember what tight junctions were for? What is the word that you associated with tight junctions? Impermeability. So I'm something funky. You guys are the capillary cells. Can I go between you? No. The most brutal game of Red Rover ever played right here, right? Because they are just kicking me out. Now, if I want to go, I can ask permission. Can I get through? And she just flips me off, right? Nope, you ain't getting through. Move along, move along, move along. And this happens over and over again with every single funky thing that happens and going through the brain. So that's it as an anatomical barrier, but it is also a physiological barrier. Because in addition, it can also control what is going to the brain. It's basically like a gatekeeper. So for instance, if the brain has a really high metabolic rate, because maybe you guys are studying for an anatomy test, right? And your brain is gobbling up glucose, and it might need more glucose, what you can say is every single bit of glucose that goes by, you grab and throw into the brain, right? If it's producing excess waste products, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to get more of it out. So that, in that way, it's a physiological barrier. Do you see? It's basically sort of controlling what goes in and out of the brain, both physiologically and anatomically. So that's what the blood-brain barrier is. So it is really kind of the last line of defense. Arguably, maybe not the last. Maybe these guys are the last, the microglial cells. Because then if something gets in there, you got your little ninjas. But one of the last lines. So let's talk about blood flow to the brain for just a second. Okay, so the brain is a blood hog. And the brain is a blood hog because even though it only accounts for 2% of your body weight, it gobbles up 20% of your oxygen and your nutrients. So it has ridiculous quantities of blood that is required. In addition, it is also really preferential about glucose, but doesn't store any. So it needs a constant supply of glucose. It doesn't really burn other nutrients very efficiently. And it has 0 capacity for anaerobic cellular respiration. What the heck do I mean by that? 0 capacity for anaerobic cellular respiration. So it can't do cellular respiration in the absence of oxygen, which means if you don't provide it with oxygen, the cells die. Okay? So it needs a constant supply of oxygen. So it has really, really constant, very high level blood requirements. So we're going to start talking in this set of notes about how you get blood flow to different organs, because after this, of course, comes cardiovascular system. So we're going to make this connection now. I won't hold you responsible for this figure now, but I'm going to revisit it when we get there later. So basically, the blood flow to the brain comes from two pairs of vessels, and I can make them make conceptual sense to you. This guy right here, that is branching off and going toward the middle right there, that is called the internal carotid artery. And I'll bet you can figure out which hole in the skull it goes through. Carotid canal, okay? You've got a pair of those that go up through the carotid canal and enter the brain from the bottom side, okay? Then you have another pair of vessels right here. This one comes off of this subclavian artery and goes right up through here. This is called the vertebral artery. That vertebral artery goes through two holes, left and right, that you only have in your cervical vertebrae. What are those holes? Transverse foramina, exactly. Does that make sense? Okay, so you got two going through the carotid canals and another two going through the transverse foramina. So you got four blood vessels that are supplying the blood supply to your brain. Does that make sense? Okay, now, again, I'm not going to ask you to do this yet until the next set of notes, but those four blood vessels end up coming from the back of your brain and the bottom. Here's the two internal carotid arteries. Those are coming right up by your pituitary gland. And here's the two vertebral arteries. She actually messed with those, and she was holding on to the brain by this guy right here, which is called the basilar artery, which we'll learn later too. Okay, so now those arteries are, of course, going to have to branch and branch and branch and branch and get small enough so that you have capillaries, right? And so the capillaries are going to control access to the tissue, and the astrocytes are going to control how the capillaries, how permeable the capillaries are. So what kinds of substances can get through and what kinds of substances can't? Well, if it is a nutrient molecule that you guys need, I promise you they will have a transport mechanism for it. Okay, so if, for instance, I'm glucose, then you guys are going to have a transport mechanism for glucose. Even though glucose is water soluble and not lipid soluble, you can still get it in, and then you can change the rate of transport based on what you guys decide. Okay, now, what other kinds of substances can't get in? Well, if it's water soluble and there's no transport mechanism, then it's not getting in, generally speaking. Now, why does solubility matter? Because these are a single layer of simple squamous epithelium. Primarily, they're just like a double layer of like cell membrane, right, with very little cytoplasm. Do you remember what cell membranes are made of? Phospholipids. So if I am lipid soluble, I can do whatever the hell I want. If I am water soluble, I'm going to have to ask permission, right? Okay, so sometimes being water soluble keeps you in to the capillary, and that's all well and good. But what if it's something that I want to get into the tissue and it's water soluble? Like, what if there's a brain infection that could use an antibiotic? I can't get it through. The blood-brain barrier actually prevents its movement through. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, right? What if in a particular disease like Parkinson's disease, there's a portion of the brain called the substantia nigra that stops producing a neurotransmitter that it needs. And so you get tremors associated with it. The neurotransmitter that it can't produce anymore is dopamine. But here's what I know. I know where the substantia nigra is, and I know how to make dopamine in the lab. So it seems like you could fix it, right? But what's the problem? You guys are the problem. The blood-brain barrier actually keeps anything from going through. So what they do now, what they have been doing, is there is a lipid-soluble precursor to dopamine that you can use that will actually get into the area and make it to the substantia nigra in the back there. And as long as there are enough living cells that can transform it from L-DOPA, lipid-soluble precursor, to dopamine, then you're going to get a relief of symptoms. So it only works in the early stages of Parkinson's disease, and then it stops working. That makes sense? Now, if you are lipid soluble, you do not respect boundaries. You go anywhere you want, anytime in the body, which is sometimes awesome because oxygen is lipid soluble, goes straight into the tissues. You don't have to worry about transport. But sometimes it's not so awesome. There are lipid soluble toxins. If they get into the bloodstream, they go anywhere they want, including the brain. Alcohol is lipid soluble. That's why if you take a sip of wine, it's literally 45 seconds before you actually feel the impact on your brain. Nicotine is also lipid soluble. You can feel the impact on your brain almost immediately. So if it's lipid soluble, it can go straight into the brain tissue. I want to, the other thing that the blood-brain barrier does is protects the tissue and the brain from fluctuations that are happening in the blood. So I want you to think about glucose for a second. Right after I eat, my glucose levels in my bloodstream are going to go way up, right? And in between meals, they're going to go right down. But if the brain has a relatively constant need for glucose, what happens is you guys are buffering what the brain experiences. So right after I eat, my glucose level goes up. What do you guys think you do to the transport level of glucose? You decrease it, right? And when my glucose levels go way down between meals, what do you guys do? You grab every bit of glucose and start dumping it into the brain. So you're kind of protecting the brain against the fluctuations that occur in the rest of the body with the blood-brain barrier. Okay, I'm going to show you this really cool new treatment that they just published last semester. I thought it was so flippin' awesome that I have to tell you guys about it. So they took advantage of the fact that we know that if you mess with the blood-brain barrier, you can get things in. So this is a treatment that was just published last semester, and it manipulates the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so let's say you have a tumor in the brain, right? And you have a chemotherapy drug that you want to get at the tumor. But remember, chemotherapy drugs tend to be toxic to a bunch of different tissues, not to like a specific tissue. What if I could develop a mechanism so that I could get that drug targeted to a location, even if it wasn't lipid soluble? Okay, here's what they did. So awesome. They injected some bubbles into the bloodstream, and they're teeny tiny bubbles, not bubbles like scuba diving that would kill you, right? Teeny tiny little microscopic bubbles. And then they figured out that if you shoot ultrasound at the bubbles or at the area, so you inject the bubbles into the bloodstream and they go everywhere and they're not harmful. But now I know I've got a brain tumor in an area of my brain. What I'm going to do is shoot ultrasound just at that area. And the combination of the ultrasound and the bubbles temporarily destroy the blood-brain barrier in that area. And I use that chance right there to inject a medication that will go straight through into only that area and target that tumor. And it was just developed. It was just developed just recently based on the knowledge of the blood-brain barrier, which is kind of awesome, right? They're thinking they might be able to use it to treat other things in the future. It's still in clinical trials, but what if we could say, oh, in schizophrenia, you're producing too little of this neurotransmitter in this area. What if every 3 months we went in and like jacked up your blood-brain barrier and actually injected the drug that you need, right? And did it every once in a while. So anyway, that's a new treatment mechanism that they just came up with based on this. Okay, so the other thing about the blood-brain barrier is that you can mess with it, and by the way, this is how they figured out this mechanism, this treatment mechanism. If you get smacked in the head and you have any inflammation or injury in the brain, it will temporarily disrupt your blood-brain barrier. And that's good and bad. Bad, of course, that's when any opportunistic pathogen could get in. Good, that's also the time that you could administer antibiotics, right? So if, for instance, I have a closed head wound, I'll answer your question in just a second, Brett. If I have a closed head wound, I have to deal with the inflammation, right, because there's no room for inflammation in the brain. So I give really strong catabolic steroids to reduce inflammation. But then in addition to doing that, I usually give antibiotics just in case, right? Just give them just in case anything got in. So they don't know that you have an infection, but they know that that's when an infection could occur. Go ahead, Brett.
What's an ECF fluctuation?
Extracellular fluid. Okay, you guys all right? Blood-brain barrier? Okay, so now let's get into the basic organization of the brain. Okay, so with the basic organization of the brain, so before we get into the details, I want you to have a big picture understanding of how the brain is organized. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the evolutionary and embryological history of the brain so that you can understand big picture. It's really easy to get lost and not understand anything functionally, so I want to start out with the forest, and then we'll get to the trees, okay? So when you're looking at the brain, of course, the big parts, there are basically 4 big parts that you are going to be concerned with. This biggest part that's really obvious is called the cerebrum, okay? And then this part right back here, it has a different folding pattern. It's like the second biggest part of the brain right here. This is called the cerebellum, right? And then this region right down here, okay, that you can see on the bottom, this is called the brain stem, okay? It includes the medulla oblongata and a couple other structures. And of course, the brain stem would be continuous with the spinal cord, right? Okay. Then the part that people have the hardest time understanding, because you can't see it unless you start opening up the brain. This is my favorite brain model. It's really hard in lab. It dismantles into 17 pieces, and it's going to make you feel like an idiot when you try to put it back together, because I have to stare at it every time. So don't, it's fine. Everybody feels like an idiot. Okay, so now we're going to take off all the parts of the cerebrum, okay, and we are going to see that deep within the cerebrum, there is a part that is under the cerebrum but sitting on top of the brainstem. Do you see it? So if this is the brainstem, you see this part, right? This part right here is the part that people have a hell of a time with. This part is called the diencephalon. Okay, does that make sense? And notice that the ventricles, you're starting to see the location of the ventricles. Do you see them? These are the lateral ventricles. So let me do a little bit of structure function relationships before we go any further. So big picture understanding to start to put this together. The oldest portions of the brain are the closest to the spinal cord. And by oldest, I mean first to develop embryologically, first to develop evolutionarily. So these old portions right here, you would not only have in common with every other human, but with every other mammal and with every other vertebrate, including fish, right? So this is a very old portion. So the brainstem does life-sustaining functionality like control heart rate and respiration, okay? And that is something that you have in common with the fish, right? That makes sense? Okay. Then we're going to start to layer some newer structures on the surface. And you might have these in common with an alligator and not a fish, okay? So these functions right here, I want you to think of more instinctual functions that are not necessarily immediately life-sustaining, but certainly quality of life-sustaining. So these, you are going to see instinctual behaviors like predatory behaviors. You're going to see jealousy. You're going to see rage. You're going to see migratory patterns. You're going to see eating patterns, breeding patterns. These things are here. Like sexuality is mostly right here, okay? So these things, do you see why those are evolutionarily sort of, not lifestyle, but it's not keeping you alive, but it's maybe species sustaining? So these functionalities are kind of old school emotions and old school instincts, those kinds of things. And you're going to have those in common with a lot of organisms, okay? Jealousy is always sort of a classic one that I like to put in here because it'll help you kind of understand. What is jealousy for? Jealousy is to make sure that, like, if you are male, the babies that you raise are your babies, right? I'm not saying I'm pro-jealousy. We're talking about an evolutionary advantage to that, right? And if you are female, what is jealousy for? I don't want to raise this baby by myself, damn it, right? You helped me make this baby. We are going to raise this baby by myself, right? Or we're going to raise this baby together. So it's keeping control of you, your resources, those kinds of things. And so you can see how those are valuable, although not necessarily like useful in society. Go ahead. It's kind of the top part of the brainstem and the diencephalon. And then there's some other structures in there too. So that's a really complex functionality, so I'm kind of giving you an overview of it. And then the last thing that we put on top is the newest part. And so when we're talking about the newest part, we're talking about the cerebrum. And so by newest, I'm going to say that your cerebrum is far more like a mammalian cerebrum than it is, for instance, like an alligator cerebrum. Okay? So this is the last to develop evolutionarily. And it's going to have things that seem closer to intelligence in it. So I want you to imagine what you have in your common with your dog. You've got a little bit of logic. You've got something that might look like a personality associated with it. And it gets more and more developed in human and more in primates that are closer to humans. So you're getting sort of more uniquely mammalian features. I'm not saying that an alligator doesn't have a cerebrum, but his cerebrum is very different than yours. So intelligence, logic, reasoning, personality, those kinds of things are all going to happen here. And this is also where consciousness occurs. So let's talk about whether a dog has consciousness. Well, so to a certain degree, you know your dog has consciousness and intelligence. It's not quite the same as your 10-year-old cousin, right? Or your 3-year-old cousin, right? But it is something. Like, I watch my dog. I watch my dog, and she's just a big, goofy golden retriever idiot. I love her. Maddie is her name. And so you watch Maddie's processing skills like this. So I've got a video chat up with my 15-year-old daughter on the computer. And Maddie, who loves Savannah, she's like looking, and Savannah's talking to Maddie. And right, she's like, oh, Maddie, how are you? And so I'm sitting on my computer, and then Maddie like looks at the computer and then walks around the back side of the computer. It's like, where the hell's Maddie? Or where the hell's Savannah? Walks around the front, looks at Savannah, walks around the back, right? Pats my computer with her paw, and I'm like, oh. So you can see that there's processing and intelligence going on. It might be different than yours, but it's like a degree difference, right? So that's what goes on in the cerebral in the cerebrum. And then the newest portion of the cerebrum is the very surface, called the cerebral cortex. We'll talk about that in just a second. The newest portion of the cerebral cortex is the most anterior portion of your brain, called the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so basically what you're seeing is old school functionality to new school functionality to uniquely human functionality, developing back to front. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so let's start talking about the cerebral hemispheres. So the cerebrum is, of course, divided immediately into two halves, right? The right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. And it is divided by this big fissure called the longitudinal fissure. She called it something different on the video, I don't remember. Intercerebral, I think she called it, intercerebral fissure. But longitudinal is what it's usually called in anatomy books. Okay, so this is the longitudinal fissure, left and right cerebral hemispheres. And we'll talk about the different functionality of the two of them, but before we get into that, let's just address the fact that if you look at the surface of the cerebrum, of course you're going to see convolutions, right? It's very curvy. And so the convolutions, let's label them. A hill is a gyrus, okay, so you've got hills. A valley is a sulcus, okay? And this right here is the Grand Canyon. That's a fissure, right? You have lots of the first two and only a few of the third. So plural for gyrus is gyri, although it sounds dumb. Plural for sulcus is, believe it or not, I swear to God, I just learned this last year and I've been teaching this for 15 years. It's sulci. That doesn't make a damn bit of sense to anybody. If it's sulcus, shouldn't it be sulci? It's sulci. I disagree with everyone, but apparently I didn't win and they didn't ask my opinion. So it's sulci, okay? Gyri and sulci, which doesn't sound right to anyone. Okay, now let's talk about the location of the ventricles with reference to the cerebral hemispheres. So remember we learned about the ventricles last time? So the ventricles right here are located within the cerebral hemispheres, but which ventricles are located within the cerebral hemispheres? The lateral ventricles are located within the cerebral hemispheres. Good? Okay, so now let's start talking about cerebral hemisphere functionality. So first let's talk about that cerebral cortex. So let's remind you of the figure that we've looked at over and over and over again. And the cerebral cortex is right here. Okay, so do you see that this is a coronal section of the brain, right? And do you see the gray matter at the superficial surface? That is the cerebral cortex. Anytime you have a cortex of something, it's going to be on the outside, right? So the cerebral cortex. It is from 2 to 6. I put 2 to 4 on your notes, but I think it might be 4 to 6. It doesn't matter a whole lot. Millimeters thick. It's not very thick at all. So if you look at this guy right here, they're trying to show you the cerebral cortex, just that little bit right there. And the cerebral cortex is like the most human part of you. It's where all of your consciousness originates. It's where all of your intelligence and your personality originates. Only this 4 to 6 millimeters on the superficial surface. So what is going on in the cerebral cortex? It's the very newest portion of their brain. This is your conscious mind. If you have any sensory perception that you become aware of, I promise you it went to your cerebral cortex. If you have any motor function that you have control of, it came from your cerebral cortex, right? This is also all your higher thought functions, your logic, your reasoning, your understanding of social interactions, all of that happens in your cerebral cortex. So later on, after you've taken your test, you should probably read about cerebral cortex functions and Brodmann's areas, but you probably won't do that until after Monday. So let's talk about the cerebral cortex and how it's divided. So the cerebral cortex is divided into lobes. So if you look here, do you see? You have some divisions that are color-coded there. You've got the frontal lobe, which is kind of roughly under your frontal bone, although it goes further back. You've got your parietal lobes. You've got your occipital lobe, and then you've got 2 right here that are called your temporal lobes. I'll show you what your temporal lobes look like. Just in here. Do you see that one going that direction? That's a temporal lobe. Okay, so apparently some of you guys have made this brain hat. I love this brain hat because it's got some anatomical. So here are your cerebral cortex lobes right here. And you can see the divisions, and the functionality is actually with them. If you actually make one of these, and I'll upload it for you if you want to make it, like there are eyeballs on the occipital lobes to remind you that it's vision that occurs back there. There are ears on the temporal lobes. That's where hearing and speech occur. And the frontal lobes is where executive function and control of motor activity occurs. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start going through the functionality of each lobe. Now, functionality is complicated as hell. So the best I can do is simplify it to the point that I give you a blurb for the functionality on each one. Now, that's what I did when I redid this set of notes. So for frontal lobe functions, do you see it's got executive functions? If you wanted a C, that would be what you remembered. If you want an A, you remember more detail than that. But what I want to happen is I don't want you to leave with zero understanding of the brain, right? I want you to leave with something that's actually portable. And if I give you 6 paragraphs to remember about the functionality of each lobe, you are going to remember 0, right? So I need to give you something that you can take with you. So let's start talking about frontal lobe anatomy and frontal lobe function. So first thing is that with the lobes, they will run until you hit a landmark. This landmark right here is called the central sulcus. Do you see that this one pretty much runs through both cerebral hemispheres right there? It's the one that's probably the easiest sulcus to find. It's called the central sulcus. And you can find it on most of the models, and you can usually find it even on a wet specimen. It's not as hard as you would imagine. And so the frontal lobe is anterior to that, but then it is also superior to this lateral sulcus, which separates the temporal lobes. You haven't learned that one yet. You'll learn it in just a second. Or I'll show you the lateral sulcus. Hold on, I have a different picture that will show you that. So do you see this sulcus right here? That's the lateral sulcus. So it's like superior to the lateral sulcus and anterior to the central sulcus, and that's how you're going to find it. Okay, so before we go any further with the cerebral cortex, I want to tell you a little bit about the development of the cerebral cortex. So here's a really cool, first off, this is what your brain looked like at 24 weeks. The cerebral cortex is pretty fascinating because what the cerebral cortex actually does is what I need, the cerebral cortex is gray matter. So it's processing power, correct? Right? It's like the cells that are actually doing the action. It's not the wires, it's the processors. You guys with me? Okay, so what can I do if I want more processing power, which of course during mammalian evolution we needed to develop more processing power. I want more processing power, but I'm limited by the architecture at how big the brain can actually get. So how do you get more cerebral cortex processing power, more area for cerebral cortex without increasing the size of the brain so much that it becomes problematic? What do? You wrinkle it, exactly. So what happens is the cerebral cortex starts to develop these convolutions. And there is a direct correlation, not between the size of your brain, but the curviness of your brain and intellectual processing power. It doesn't work between people. Right? It would be so minor between two people that the anatomy wouldn't correlate to the physiology. But if you compared me to a sheep, I would have a lot more surface area for my brain, right? Okay, so this is a fetus at 24 weeks. And then they actually developed a cool little animation that shows you the development of the brain growth and the cerebral cortex functioning. It's actually not an animation, sorry, it's a simulation that they actually developed. They developed it to show you how the cerebral cortex actually develops and folds. So pretty damn interesting to see what's actually going on there. Okay, so when we look at the cerebral cortex in the frontal lobe, let's look at its functionality in the frontal lobe. So if we're looking at the frontal lobe anatomy, it's from like about here up. And what is the function of the frontal lobe? Well, it's responsible for these really high-level, almost uniquely human functions, because this is the last part in the entire brain to develop. Okay, so they call it executive functions. And so I want you to think about you being the executive in any situation. You are the decision maker, you are the processor, you have the intellectual and social capacity to command what is going on in the rest of your body. So does that make sense? So executive functions. So let's break down executive functions a little further and look at a couple of different parts of the brain. Okay, so a part of the brain that is not labeled on here, because nobody can really quite agree at where it starts and where it stops, but we're going to call it the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex would be the most front of the front, right? The most anterior part of the frontal cortex is called the prefrontal cortex, a lot of times abbreviated PFC, prefrontal cortex. It is the very last part in your brain to develop. As a matter of fact, it's very important for you guys all to know that the prefrontal cortex is actually not matured until you are fully matured. And that occurs, anybody want to guess what age your prefrontal cortex? What? About 25. Slightly later in one gender than the other. Yes, males. Okay. So in girls, it's about 22 to about 26 is the average. And in boys, it's about 23 to about 27. Okay. Now, why the hell do you care that this is the last thing to mature? Because what happens in the prefrontal cortex is so much importance of being an adult. So this is where your planning, your reasoning, your understanding of the impact of decisions you will make on today for the future that may not occur for 10 years, 15 years, 30 years. Your understanding between those two things. Your personality is not completely developed until then. Your intelligence, your social skills are not completely developed until then. So let's talk first about what happens, for instance, in someone who damages that area so that you can understand the importance of the prefrontal cortex. So if you have someone who has a lesion or a damage in that area, one of the first things that seems to happen is you see changes in personality and social skills. And these social skills that you've been learning throughout your entire childhood and adulthood are very important with how to interact with other people. For instance, why do people not grab other people's genitals in public? I mean, except for our presidential candidate. Why do you not do that, right? Because your prefrontal cortex is telling you that this is how I behave in social situations if I want to maintain my social contacts, right? Okay? I just thought of this when I was lecturing the last time. I swear we just need to get an fMRI in him because I don't think everything's working on him. I think I figured it out, man. He wants a drug test, but I would like a brain imaging test. That's what we need. Okay, so why do you not interact violently every time you have a violent thought? Why do you not take things from other people when they are things that you want? Because your prefrontal cortex matures, right? And you can see the difference between a toddler and a teen and a 35-year-old most of the time, right, with these behaviors, right? Or 70-year-old most of the time with these behaviors. So these intelligence and these social skills are all maturing slowly, and you really don't have the capacity to understand the implications of decisions that you make today, 10 years in the future, when you can't actually conceptualize 10 years in the future, right? It's not actually there yet. This is really important for those of us who are parents, or for those of us who are children, or somewhere in between parents and children, which is what you guys are. Somewhere in between. You're not actually children, but you're not baked yet either. I mean, let's just acknowledge it. Because if I look back to the decisions that I made when I was 18, I am literally thinking, who the hell thought that was a good idea, right? Who the hell thought that was a good idea? So here's the deal. This is why I teach this to my kids. If you can't understand the implications of decisions you make today, and you're making decisions that are forever decisions, like getting married, okay? Nobody should be able to get married before 25. Like, literally nobody, right? You have no idea who you like because you don't even know who you are yet, okay? Join the military. You know you're about to do something that says that you could die, and you don't even understand what death is, actually. You can't conceptualize death at that point. Join a religion. I know that's super unpopular to say in this state, but my children are not allowed to join a single religion until they can flip me off at 18 and do whatever the hell they want. But I'll try to keep it to 20 to 25. My daughter insists that she is going to be married before she is 22, and I am going to tackle her. Right? I have bribed her. She wants to look really pretty in a dress. And she's like, well, I look amazing at 22. And I'm like, and you look really good divorced at 27. Right? She does not listen. I think that that's her way of rebelling, right? It is her way of rebelling. She wants to do everything that I know. She doesn't want to go to college. Mm-mm. She hates science. She wants to get married yesterday. What the hell is going on? Okay, so that's a prefrontal cortex. Now, just so you know, I loved being 18, but I'm just not the same person now that I was when I was 18, and she won't be either. Okay, so what else goes on there? What else goes on? There's a couple other areas. So this was the prefrontal cortex up here, but go all the way to the back. Do you see? This is the central sulcus. Do you see that area that's just anterior to the central sulcus right there? Okay, the location is called the precentral gyrus. And if you break that down, it makes sense, doesn't it? The precentral gyrus. Okay, now, what does that part do? That part's really interesting. So the precentral gyrus has what we call the primary motor cortex in it. Okay, so here we are, frontal lobe. Just anterior to the frontal lobe right here is the precentral gyrus, or the primary motor cortex. To make you understand what that does, we have to imagine that what's going on is this side right here, this stripe right here on my cerebrum, is going to control somatic motor activity. Help me before we go any further. Somatic motor activity. Voluntary movement of tissue, skeletal muscle. Voluntary movement of skeletal muscle for the opposite side of my body. Okay, so this region right now, if they did an fMRI on me, would be lighting up while I did this, but also lighting up while I did that and that, right? It's over on this side of my brain, okay? So this side controls that side for reasons we'll talk about later. This side controls that side. Okay, so it's called the primary motor cortex. And what they have figured out is you can map to where things are controlled. So look at the blue right here, okay? Here's the precentral gyrus. Notice what they did right there. Okay, so you can map how much architecture, how much processing power you give to controlling the motor activity of different regions of your body. And notice that it is not evenly distributed, is it? How much surface area do you devote to your face? A lot. And your hands? A bunch. How about your knee? Doesn't get a whole hell of a lot of real estate, right? And your toes get far less than your fingers, right? And if you think about dexterity and teeny tiny movements, that makes sense, right? If you need to be able to control it more carefully, you need more surface area. You need more architecture, okay? So somebody took this, which I love, and made it into a model that represents proportionally how much brain space you get to controlling each thing. And it's right here, which is pretty damn cool. It was pretty cool. Okay, so this is called a motor homunculus. So really there's not a whole heck of a lot of motor control of your arms or your legs, right? And then they made a different one for sensory control, and you can always tell the difference because this guy has a big penis on it. You don't have a whole lot of motor control of your penis, but you got a lot of sensation going on there. Okay, does that make sense? So that's called the primary motor cortex. It's in the precentral gyrus, and it controls the motor activity of the opposite side of the body. Okay, okay, one last thing, and then I'll let you guys go. And that is that the last thing on the frontal lobe is this little purple area. Do you see it right there? Okay, that purple area right there is called the motor speech area, or Broca's area. And so what that area does is, in most of us, about 80% of us, it's only on the left side. We don't have a Broca's area on the right side. Okay, so over here on the left side, so anterior to the lateral sulcus, sorry, superior to the lateral sulcus, right, and anterior to this structure that we just looked at. So that's where Broca's area would be. So what does Broca's area do? I'll show you a video next time of when this goes bad. But Broca's area is responsible for producing written and spoken language. So here's what Broca's area does. I can look at a tissue box, and my brain can come up with the word tissue box, right? And that doesn't happen in Broca's area. But if I want to either write tissue box or say tissue box, I need to get motor activity involved in doing that. Do you agree? Okay. If Broca's area is broken, you end up with a type of speech disturbance called Broca's aphasia. And what happens with Broca's aphasia is I know the word, but I can't produce the word. I can't dependably write it, and I can't dependably get it out of my face, okay? So it's incredibly frustrating. So if you have a stroke in the left frontal lobe, left cerebral hemisphere, then you can get this halting speech pattern called Broca's aphasia. So if what I'm trying to say to her is I want a cracker, right? What I'm trying to say to her is I want a cracker, and I'm not going to just take the cracker, although quite often they would. You're just like, and I know the word, and I can't come up with the word, and it's incredibly frustrating, and I can't produce it, I can't write it. So this takes the symbology of language in your head and produces it with something that you can communicate with another person. It's called the Broca's motor speech area, or Broca's motor area. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'll show you next time an 18-year-old girl who had a stroke in Broca's area. I will show you her trying to come up with her speech patterns, and then we'll talk about a couple of different things. So last little tidbit is a lot of this stuff that they know now, because we have the Bill of Rights and we have a bunch of other protections for human rights that usually we pay attention to. We can't do experimentation on people by just jacking up part of their brain and seeing what happens. So how do you think we get a lot of this information? Somebody has a stroke and this part doesn't work anymore, right? Somebody sticks a fork in their head and they can't lick their left nostril anymore. I don't know. It's all like anecdotal, right? But compiled, it gives you a decent amount of information about what's going on. Okay, I'll see you guys on Friday.
So
Good luck on your practicals.
can that 18-year-old girl relearn?
She is in the process of relearning, and I think the video is like a year or so after she did it, and she's already regained some functionality. The part is dead, but the brain has what we call neuroplasticity. Remind me to talk about neuroplasticity next time. And it actually just passes it off to another part.
But that part, so the Broca's area
gone.
is gone.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
It's actually
now-
just filled with astrocytes. It's the brain's equivalent of scar tissue.
So now, for instance, when you're relearning it, it will go to the frontal.
Yeah, it goes somewhere else in the body. I don't know if it's consistent where it goes. That's actually kind of a good thought to wonder about.
Thank you so
Uh-huh.
much.
See ya. Uh-huh.
The guy model
Oh, yeah.
that you pulled up.
Homunculus? Uh-huh.
Yeah. So on that, how come the tongue is so big? Is it because the head promotes so much surface
No,
area, or because of the sensation?
it's sensation.
Sensation,
Yeah.
okay.
No, this is, sorry, motor activity. This is motor activity. No, sorry. This one is motor activity, but the tongue has a tremendous amount of dexterity, and you
Okay.
use it in talking, and you use it in manipulating your food.
Okay.
And in order to be able to talk, you need to have a lot of dexterity
Okay.
and communication in your tongue, and you also have a lot of dexterity in moving food around and suckling and those kinds of things.
Okay. So is one that's promoted to motor and then not?
This is motor.
Okay, not
And I haven't done this
sensation.
one yet, but this one is
And that makes sense because
sensation.
of the lips and the tongue.
Yeah,
and stuff like
exactly.
that. Okay.
Yeah,
Got it.
it's just kind of cool.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so I have a
Mhm.
stupid question. So